it's because the bar stayed open late or the coffee line's short, but it's probably one of the two. First of all, glad to have you guys back. Most of you, I see your faces from yesterday. Got a really good lineup today to start the morning off, and man, I don't know if y'all looked throughout the day, but there are some really, really good speakers. It's going to be hard. It's going to be bouncing from one room to room to room for me, trying to get a little bit of this person and this person and this person. It's pretty incredible have this many speakers lined up at once to talk. You know, I'm anxious. I'm glad they're going to have videos of all the talks to be able to go home and digest it. My small mind, I can only digest so much at a time. So there's a lot of information here. So we, our first speaker, she's not. Oh, you're back, Pat. Sorry, I didn't see you. We actually got. We got the B team this morning, but it's a blessing because the B team is actually the A+ team, I would say. We had a speaker that wasn't able to make it, and Pfeil, she's one of our board members. She's stepping in, and I'm excited to listen to her speak. She's got a lot of really good experience. Pat, since 2004, has represented the International Society for Range Management on our National Grazing Lands Board of Directors. Pat's one of the ones that I would say probably keeps us in line as well as anybody. You know, I know she pushes me and gets more out of me than anybody else does. You know, and that says a lot because you've got to have those people. Those people they're the ones that get results. You know, Pat and her husband Brady are natural resource managers for a 9th generation Florida agriculture family. They've worked as partners in managing the Carlton family holdings in Florida since 1978. And in Georgia since 2006. As such, they have developed about 24,000 acres of ranches, and they've also managed the Bar A Brangus registered herd, commercial cattle herds, citrus groves, Bahia sod, timber stands, vegetable, hay, and seed production, plus maintaining a viable wildlife population. Pat, her duties were mainly to oversee the cattle production and the grazing management, and along with all the record keeping. And as you guys know, that is the least fun job ever in ranching. The Pfeils they're very blessed, feel very blessed to work with a good Christian family that want to be stewards of the land, and their willingness to sustain the environment along with the financial future of their next generation. It led them to win the Florida Department of Agriculture Environmental Stewardship Award and being a NCBA Region 2 ESAP winner. So if you guys don't mind, please welcome Pat Pfeil here this morning. They had a clicker here, but
it should be. There it is. Okay. Let's see. Oh, we have to get it started, is it? Get it. Well, good morning. You came to hear about Nevada, and you're going to hear about the Southeast and actually all of Florida. This is running, and I got to stop it. Hold on just a moment. How do we stop this? Someone help me here? It's not supposed to do this. Okay. There's no pause on here. We've got to change the setting. I learned that earlier. It's running. I can't not talk as fast as this is going. Okay. I talk fast, but not that good. Okay. We'll have to go back to the beginning and change how it runs somehow. But it's not, see, I don't want you to click off, use the timings. Yeah. Yeah, the timings are too fast. Thank you. Now we should start. Okay.
Let's see if it does it now.
Aha. Okay, thank you. I might have to remind myself to click, but at least that's better than going to, I'll get to talking so fast you won't know what I said. Okay. I'm from South Florida. As the introduction told you, we have a property there we've been blessed to manage. My husband is my boss, my best friend, and stays home when I'm here and vice versa. We don't usually travel together, so. But I do have one, and he's a very special person. We're almost 50 years married now. South Florida is a typical Gulf Coast area. We have pines, palmettos, a lot of swamp, and so I'll give you a little perspective of what it's like, because it's like going on a tour. It helps to see the spot. And those pasture walks are the best things that ever happen because you see what it looks like, what you're working with, and you can then visualize this is what it could be or this is what I don't want it to be. So when you're trying to learn better and unique ways to manage, this is the 2 before is one of the 5 ranches that we managed and we lived on for 30 years. In Florida, you have some very interesting situations. In 2006, that's what Florida looked like. This is a growth management map. We're already headed there much faster than what it shows on here is 2060. Our ranches are right here that we're managing for the Carltons. See that red? Right in there and a little bit right here. That's the location. That means that it's going urban fast. Back in 2006, we were very concerned about our state. If we hadn't had the crash, and I'm sorry for all of us that lost money, including us, but I'm glad it happened because it was out of control. And we would have been in the 2060 position in 20 years instead of. So now we bought time, and the state bought time, and the ranchers got to assess, again, what's valuable to them and their families. And it's not always money. And it's a long, sad story for a lot of families. Okay, but what I want to talk to you today about is how we integrated wildlife management. Is it too close? Okay, not close enough. Okay, how we integrated our wildlife management while staying sustainable and economically first and environmentally second. We're in a state that environmental issues are right behind California. The coastline has the voting power. The interstate area where we live are 2% of the population. Typical is a national thing. Urban controls. Trying to get urban to understand the importance of Central Florida and the center area is very difficult. Originally, we had 5 ranches. The first ranch, the Deep Creek, that was 100% pine palmetto, financially very difficult to support. You can't run a cow to 50 acres. That's not going to last when your taxes use every bit of that up that you would make off of one animal unit. We had the Half Moon and Upper Horse Creek ranches. Those were a little better, had 50% river swamp and scattered wetlands. They were a little more sustainable, those two. The Rusty Pot Ranch was the best to us. That particular location had 33% flatwoods, grazable, good land with very good tame pasture mixed with it. So you could do some pretty good financial work up on that. And then we had the 2 before ranch, the one you're looking at. 95% tame acres. That means that everything had been converted by farming at one time, and there was very little native left. The most challenging to maintain as an agricultural operation without being a farmer, which we're not. So that was our challenges. We had management goals. Albert believed in that what God allowed you to have and oversee, you need to take care of and leave it better for the next generation. Dr. Carlton desired a legacy in leaving a healthy bobwhite quail population in South Florida. She was the hunter, he was not. It was her passion. It still is today. Turkey hunting is her #1 activity at 86 years old. And so more power to her. I hope I can do that. Financial sustainability was a necessity. Albert believed in cash only. You talk about cash flow. We did not borrow. We weren't allowed to. What we made is what we spent. So here we had all that acreage, and what you made is what you spent. Challenging, but fun, and at least you didn't have to worry about the banker being your partner. Being a good steward of what God allows you to oversee is a life's work, and we were privileged to learn that from him. So this 7th generation family having this ranch land, 28,000 acres total at one time. They were in 4 counties. We had 150 miles between some of the ranches, and each had different systems, different wildlife habitats. We eventually were grazing 5,000 head of cattle, and we had other enterprises which have been mentioned, but timber was one of them, farming, hay, seed, citrus, etc. From there, we moved on into production of sod and citrus eventually, and I'll get to that. This is the cow herd we inherited when my husband and I went to work for the Carltons. That is a very typical South Florida cow herd in the 70s. And they had horns to protect themselves. They were a model group of every bull you'd ever heard of. And they were always generally bulls that no one else wanted. They came to South Florida, and that's where they sold them. And that's what they worked with. So the genetic package was pretty poor. Okay. Something you Westerners might totally not understand. You've had this certain breeds forever. Well, that in 75 was a diverse herd in Florida and pretty typical. We went from there to try to figure out how to manage this land. Brady and I were fairly new. We'd only been on a livestock operation for 3 years prior to going to work for the Carltons. And Albert trusted us because we had a good reputation for hard work and for loving the Lord. And that was the two things that to him were important. And so he didn't mind letting us learn, and we did, and we cost him money in the process, but we all learned as we went. We started through SRM. We've been introduced to the society through the first ranch we were on before we worked for the Carltons. And they provided us access to other areas to see what people were doing, and they exposed us to things that were economically sustainable for wildlife management. And it taught us how to work with scientists, someone I had never come up on before. My husband had been a cowboy and a construction worker, and I had ran a masonry company. I didn't know anything about science, nor using ecological science in what we were doing. So that was a great learning curve. From there, we also went to all the beef cattle short courses University of Florida presented, and we used the local range cattle station for information. But the biggest help to us at that time was NRCS that helped us to analyze what we had and showed us new grazing methods and helped to educate us in conservation practices that were sustainable and that would actually benefit our bottom line for the Carltons. Very important facts for us. Our management plan back then was to have wildlife leases. That was an easy one. Quail management back then was easier. We were using the box-type feeders. The cattle, we were chopping, burning, and mowing for the pasture management. We put out tremendously high fertilizer rates on the tame acres because that was the accepted practice being used through the university, and that's what we were told to do. And we did. We had a 4-pasture weekly rotation. We were grazing 1 animal unit to every 1.2 acres on tame acres. The places that had the native, of course, we used those in the winter. They were offset and deferred grazing. And on the one place that was year-round, and that was never sustainable. We did have vegetable farm leases. That's very typical in our area, especially if you want to convert native acres to tame acres, or if you want to rejuvenate your fields after time to get them renovated. After a 10-year span, you can let a vegetable farmer come back in and refarm. They can't do any quicker for watermelons, and that was the #1 crop. So at every 10 years, you could renovate a field, and they would actually put it back down for you. And then from there, we had hay sales and also timber management. So we moved on through the timber was probably the most fun part, of course, and that's where the wildlife lived naturally. So that was easy for us. During this time, we're rotating our cattle, five herds at the time. Anyway, we're doing the 4-pasture rotation, around 300 head to the herd. And it was a 7-day grazing on tame acres. And the results of that at that time, that we had good native bird hunting for that 10-year period. Our pastures were fairly diverse. Because of the chopping, we were keeping a lot of legumes and a variety of native, and we got quite wet. It was what they referred to as a dry prairie, and the 2 before there, and that was our main one. That one, we could carry cattle pretty heavily in there, and we found that the prices started decreasing on the cattle. We weren't making as much net, so we were looking at how to diversify. We got rid of our registered purebred herd. They were costing us too much. It wasn't cost effective. But we gave up our genetic control at the same time, which was a serious issue in the future. We converted the 850 acres to citrus. My husband got into citrus, and I then had to handle all the cattle. But more than that, we lost, the Carltons received funding from 10,000 acres worth of sales of those other properties that I mentioned that the state thought were so valuable that they needed to be preserved. And so they bought them. And by then, the family knew that this was the last generation to stay on the land. They had bought 4 ranches for their kids, and none of them wanted to come home to them. And I'll cry if I talk about that. I don't want to talk about that. Okay. But it brings back memories of how you build and then it falls away. And there's great planning here to help stop some of that. You need to access it. But they didn't have that advantage at that time, and that family watched their kids move away. Great kids, but not vested in the property. So they sold it. The state loves it. It became wildlife preserves. And they protected it, and they removed the cattle, and then they learned they were wrong, and they've tried to put them back, not very successfully. Okay, so we moved on and continued our management, and we had a very good cow herd by now. If you remember that early picture, well, 10 years, you can change it. Hard work, a lot of cattle buying and selling, and bringing in very good bull power that we were raising, and therefore we were able to change the herd. And at that time, we had Brayford, Brangus, and Beefmaster cattle. We ended up with all Brangus because financially they were the best for us. And so that's where we continue to go today. So our cattle have changed. We're down to a 90-day breeding season from that 180 where we started. And the citrus, which back at that time was turning over 1,000 an acre net, was a great investment. And that expanded from that 800 to a potential 2,400. Didn't get there because of the financial changes in life, but it was headed there. But we had replaced our burning and our chopping with mowing that was faster. You could mow 3 times faster than you can chop. You can only chop at very certain times. You can mow for weed control at other times for longer periods of time. And we worked with 2 men on that. I had 2 employees and 1 on my share with the Grove. My kids worked for us. My husband and I worked, but that was it. So you've got 5,600 acres of tame acres to take care of and over 1,500 head of cattle, and we got 2 of us out there on the ground. I'm not an on-the-ground person. I'm a cow pen record keeper. That's what I do. I love to process cattle, and I work in the office. So I wasn't much good in the field. Anyhow, but we did learn to drop our cow numbers. We dropped down from that 1 acre or 1.2 acres. We started carrying a cow to 3. And by doing that, we stopped fertilizing. We didn't have to lime now as fast because we weren't fertilizing, so liming became every 5 to 7 years in our area instead of every 3. So that dropped our cost. And we were still financially sustainable. In the 30 years at the 2 Before Ranch with 95% tame acres, we had 1 red year on the books. Only 1 year that we did not break even or make some profit. And so we were very low input, okay? And we made it work, but it was because of the grazing that we were using. And we also ended up working with kids, and we had a few women interns. Couldn't get anybody else at that time. We had 2 women that were willing to come, and we used those to get the calves addressed at birth. We modified our grazing. We went to the 8 pasture, 3 herds, found that we could do better, have a more diverse pasture, and make the grass go further. We fed no hay. That's an input. We didn't want to do that. So year-round, no hay ever to a cow herd. We supplemented heifers and raising them, and we changed our grazing as we went. We would have the grazing specialists would come through and talk to us, suggest some things, notice things that we didn't notice, and we would make changes. But back to the wildlife. Our deer were flourishing. Our turkey were starting to actually be on the prairie, which was almost unheard of. But the quail diminished. And in '98, Dr. Carlton stopped hunting quail in the wild and started put and take, and continued that way from then on. We had a cow herd. We produced more with less. We owned our cattle all the way through harvest, so we knew what we were producing. We knew what our beef quality was, and that was going great. And I actually went through Decatur feeders out in Oberlin, Kansas. That's where we were feeding out at that time and working on our very early grids, and it paid well for us. So, but in all of this, the Bahia grass improved, so did the sod market as we had more urban areas and more grass going down, so we sold sod. And I used all the technical assistance I could get, and one of the grazing specialists is here in the room is Pete. Pete knows our operation very well. And so that's, anyway, trying to continue the legumes, trying to look at our grazing, how we could do better. I did something wrong. There. Okay, here we go. So we expanded our citrus. It returns better. We went to weekly rotation. We were expanding our sod. We started selling aquatic vegetation. We had very clean, very nice wetlands, and therefore we were able to sell the wetland species to be used for restoration projects. And our cattle had become a tool for our grazing to make everything else work better. They were a tool for the sod production. And you go, well, now I've got even shorter, more compact grass. That's hard on quail, and that can be hard on wildlife. And so did our wildlife demise. Yes, the quail went backwards, but the others were okay, and we continued on with that. We did get into some mob grazing, which helped with the weed control. That was one of those funny kind of stories, but we weren't going to do it. Pete had come out multiple times and mentioned it to us over, once a year, and gee, have you tried this? I think it would really benefit you. And the spring is our droughts in South Florida, so you go for 3 to 4 months without not enough rain, and your grass gets really short. Well, a gate broke. The herds had calves on them, and they got together, and we couldn't get them separated until weaning. Okay, so now we were mob grazing. You didn't have a choice. You had 800 cows in that herd with their calves at side and your own short grass. And so we moved them, and we moved them every day, every other day, whatever it took. And in that 26 paddock, and it worked so good, and it removed so many weeds, that from then on, my husband, who observes all of this and tells me what to do, he goes, figure out how to do that next year. And so that's how we got into mob grazing, okay, with the broken gate, anyhow. So now you're looking at the ranch again. It shows you a little bit about how the pasturing now has changed. Even though we have all those paddocks, we're now able to do part of the year one type of grazing and the rest of the year another type, which is what worked out for us for labor and for grass growth, and proceeded to help us keep our weight up without fertilizing, which on tame acres is quite hard. Now I got that 23 pasture one herd for a 3-day rotation, et cetera, and from weaning to pre-calf. We did control the time of year. So the results were, okay, our return was good, improving. We had tried preserving some land. Dr. Carlton thought that from hearing wildlife biologists talk that she had to have set-aside land you couldn't have any cattle on. We put in 10 miles of fence to do that, and went out and just fenced out little areas on, we had very few trees. We fenced out those little shrub areas for them, and, in some of the wetland areas, et cetera. And after the 10 years of that, it was so grown up that there wasn't a bird that would go in it. There was nothing that would go in it. So we pulled it all out and had to carefully burn it and clean it back up with choppers again. And the wildlife now, we had turkey nesting on the property. Quail hunting was still the put and take, the native quail, no change, and even though we spent a lot of money trying. And the deer were getting bigger racks, better, and for our area doing quite well. And of course we had all those native things that people like to see in the way of birds. We had a tremendous bird population that was a story in its own, and made us stand out as far as our resource went for the wildlife part. And then we go to the quail, which in South Florida is quite an issue because everybody was so concerned, as we all used to be able to hunt quail, and now they can't, and what could we do? Well, Tall Timbers was going to do some research, and they had the goal to restore the native population to the 1980 levels, and they knew that they need to work on the cattle ranches because they'd already established that was the best places to do that, and they wanted some properly managed habitat. Well, 95% tame acres is not what any wildlife biologist wants to work with. They go, no, we're not coming here. And I said, well, we have a few, and we'd really like to have more. And they go, and I said, Dr. Carlton will really help you. And no, we can't do that. They went next door and did some surveys to several ranches, but the one next to us was 55,000 acres of native range. And it had been a hunting preserve for years. And they hunted quail and everything, but they were put take also, much longer than we had been. They did their surveys over there, and they came back and they said, we've been in 3 counties, and you have the best quail population that there is, that we need to do our research here. So we went into the research project, and they came in and Poor little birds. They stuffed those things with little monitors on them, and they chased them and found out what predator was getting them and where they lived and where they didn't live and how the nests were doing and how much success they had. And so here you own this property. You've got all the yellow is tame acres, and the other is where the birds lived. And so, that quail management area had that 840 plus acres, 15% of the area of the ranch became our wildlife management park. And I had a half section in the bottom of the ranch down south right here. That was actually left to native prairie. It was very wet, shallow, hard pan type thing, shallow soils, so couldn't really be farmed, so it never got converted. And we left it that way. We left that as our little special hunt spot, and it worked out very well. But the rest of the property just had those brown spots you see on there that we managed for quail. And what we found, we saw a 100% increase in the brood habitat when we started just managing those areas for quail, and went from there. And we had little growing season burns on those, some short duration mob grazing on them, and watch for diversity in the grass. They actually burned in the summer, which in Florida is a real trick. You're walking in water and you're setting a fire. Really fun to watch, very labor intense, and you won't do it as a rancher, but the researchers said, oh, we can do this. Okay, they did. They said it wasn't a very practical thing to do when they got done. So anyhow, but it was fun. And so what did we end up with? Trying to restore the quail. It's hard, it's expensive. You will not do it without technical assistance and funds, and you sure need some cost share on it because it's not sustainable otherwise. It takes a lot of cooperation, a lot of trust, and you got to have patience and diligence for all of those. So that whole process, everything benefits when ranchers will work with others in partnership for some things and stay sustainable and out of debt. That's great. If it's possible, you can maintain your open space, and hopefully you can keep it for that next generation and keep them on the land. And that challenge, though, if you don't install the concept of being a good steward of what God allows them to oversee as a life work, worth the effort, worth the education, then it won't succeed. And so I challenge you to think about it that way. It's not, as the generation that Albert and Barbara, who worked hard to get what they got and wanted their kids to automatically want it, and they didn't because they told them, oh, this doesn't make any money, you barely get through, you need to go get a profession. And they moved away from the property, and they didn't come back. And they didn't want to come back then, and by the time they want to, it'll be gone. And that's a sad thing, but that's how it is. They can't change that today. But I challenge y'all to change that for your homes and your land. Install that work ethic. Install that love of the land. And the wildlife will work with you there, and you will flourish. Thank you.